capacity factor. Some question whether that's technically feasible. Our gas members don't, but as in a minute, I'll point out how do you get there? How does an individual state take what would otherwise happen from the economics of the market and force the market to produce a 70% capacity factor? It's important to remember that natural gas and the power fuel was not always thought of to be the preferred way the country should go. I first came to Capitol Hill in 1981, fresh out of college. The first piece of legislation the congressman I worked for asked me to introduce, or have him introduce and have me work to enact, was to repeal the Fuel Use Act of 1978. Those of us old enough in the room to remember, I know the Fuel Use Act by decree of Congress said no power generation from natural gas. And the famous quote was the then senator from Kentucky, appropriate that this would be a senator from a coal state, Wendell Ford, who said using natural gas for power was like brushing your teeth with Kentucky bourbon, neither of which should be allowed. And so we once actually said by law, a certain type of fuel could not be used for power generation, and it took almost a decade to repeal that law. So as absurd as it sounds today, when all of you in this room and across the country and under the EPA plan are looking to deploy more natural gas, the importance and the relevance of telling you that story is that policy choices really matter, whether it's at the federal level or the state level. And so I'll just quickly give you 6 issues that I would keep an eye on, that we're working on. I'm going to hear from my colleague Will Preach from the Edison Electric Institute. Increasingly, competitive suppliers, utilities, fuel groups like the Natural Gas Supply Association and America's Natural Gas Alliance are working together when we can in Congress and in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to try to improve the policies, particularly as they relate to wholesale markets. So the 6 issues I would be watching as you look at this. The first is the Clean Power Plan. You might say, well, of course this is great for natural gas. This one building block 2 says run the CCGTs at 70%. That's certainly positive for existing and new gas power generation. But the proverbial devil's in the details. At least to us, it is yet unclear how, when you have states like in PJM, 14 different states, 13 states in the District of Columbia, in a regional power market, if you take a look at the state-by-state emissions rate reduction targets, they vary greatly between adjoining states that are in the same power market. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has these great graphics that essentially show sort of what they call the tail of the Delaware River, which I heard for the second time 2 weeks ago. And if I had it to share with you, I would, but it's proprietary to Bloomberg. But if you could imagine the Delaware River between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and the reduction targets in the states are drastically different. So the exact same power plant on opposite sides of the Delaware River could very well be dispatched far differently depending on the choices states make in implementing the Clean Power Plan. So the focus of our comments to EPA last December really were about how do you take a wholesale power market that's administered by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, operated by the RTOs, based on and using bid-based economic dispatch, constrained economic dispatch, so you're running the least cost plants to meet demand. That model, which is how the plants get dispatched, how power generators, new and existing, get paid, that does not follow the boundaries of individual states. Yes, they take into account emissions limitations today, but unlike past clean air programs, so we heard this morning, and I'm no critic, and we're not criticizing the Clean Power Plan itself, it's simply to point out that what's happening today is not like the past programs under the Clean Air Act. Everything else until now has involved basically putting emission controls on power plants to meet the standards, whether it's for MATS, for mercury, or other pollutants going back to the enactment of the law. Developers and operators could then bid those costs, include those costs into their bids. Now the Clean Power Plan, for good reasons that we heard, is much broader than that, beyond the fence. It's going to how plants are dispatched. And it's not yet clear what kind of choices states would make, whether states in PJM as diverse as, say, Maryland and New Jersey versus Kentucky and Virginia could come together on a regional plan. There's also the potential for gaming the system in that, as you heard, the existing plants are under the 111D as in David, or sometimes people say 111D as in dog, depending on your perspective, section of the law. Plants that were in commercial operation after January of 2014 are under an entirely separate plan. So they're outside of the existing plant restrictions. So several analysts have run lots of numbers to show the potential, depending on the emissions target in a given state and the emissions from the new plant, that a new plant outside of the program for existing plants could actually be advantaged. New plants would have an artificial advantage compared to existing plants. So these are just some of the actual detailed reasons and how this is going to be administered, which is why it's so important that EPA work closely with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They've had some discussions, they've had some listening sessions. We're working on additional analysis, and we're hoping, and we'll know by midsummer, whether or not the two agencies can really work together, not just on the surface, but in practice. And EPA was recently admonished by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in a case involving behind-the-meter generators, where they were going to exempt certain behind-the-meter generators from clean air requirements, that EPA has the environmental expertise, but FERC really has the reliability and markets expertise. And the court, in that context, urged them and required them to work more closely together, and we hope that the same thing happens here. The second issue is really all about renewables. We have members like NRG that are one of the largest renewable developers. We have others involved in solar and wind, and we heard discussion about hydro, which is a good point to make. But if you look at, as you all know, the recent new build has been primarily gas or renewables. Yet renewables policy, particularly at the state level, could impact not only how much natural gas actually ends up being used in power generation, but as you know, how the plants are actually operating. Now this will come partly out of the Clean Power Plan, because renewables, of course, would be one of the building blocks, but also from state policy. So many of our members have assets in California. I spent some time out there. As you know, California has a very high RPS standard. The governor wants to push it even higher. Hawaii is looking to 100% renewable standard. We heard the announcement from Tesla about storage. There's a whole debate about net metering. And so there's nothing particularly wrong with renewables. It's just that as California is experiencing, if you get a lot of rooftop solar, if you get a lot of wind, you end up with negative pricing during the day, the infamous duck chart. We have a lot of solar, obviously, during the daytime, and then gas is being counted on to manage the ramp up and the ramp down, which is actually more severe than the grid operator thought would be true. But that takes policies at the state level, and particularly at the federal level with the wholesale markets, to make sure that gas plants are compensated appropriately if they're in fact going to run less often. So lower volumetric energy revenue, but the impact, wear and tear, O&M of the plants is actually going to be greater with the ramp up. So there's a potential not only for loss of market share between gas and renewables, there's also how the gas plants are expected to operate and whether or not the current rules properly compensate those gas plants for doing so. The third issue I would look at is the whole question of how power markets operate at the wholesale level. We'll hear more from Lopa on this and during our Q&A. But for power plants, as you know, energy markets are the largest source of revenue. But the focus at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has largely been on capacity markets. Those issues are important for the eastern RTOs where they exist. But we've documented, working with EEI and the Nuclear Energy Institute, the two gas trades I mentioned, that really right now all plants, particularly baseload power plants and gas plants as well, are not being fairly compensated because of the arcane ways in which the LMPs are determined, the market prices are determined by the RTOs. And this didn't matter so much when wholesale prices were higher, back around 2008 to 2009. But as you know, power prices tend to track gas prices. It's great for the country that gas prices are so low, but the impact of that on power markets has been to suppress markets, suppress revenues. Here in Illinois, there's a debate between those with nuclear plants in northern Illinois and coal plants in southern Illinois as to whether or not the nuclear plants, rather up here in the northern part of the state, should be under some sort of clean power standard to help them. There's been concern about nuclear plants in Ohio and New York. And since we're a fuel diverse group, we don't get involved in trying to pick fuels. We think that's not only a bad form for given the broad breadth of the membership, but for the country, markets have served the country well. Markets should make these choices, but the rules really need to be reformed. We need to make sure that plants are being compensated appropriately. FERC, to its credit, held 3 workshops last fall on these issues, and there's a new chairman of FERC, Norman Bay, as of a month ago, and many of us are urging him to make reforming these issues a priority, so that instead of having these one-off state-by-state battles between fuels, we have sort of a rising tide lifts all boats. All fuels should compete and compete fairly, but the market rules need to reflect the attributes that the fuels bring to the market. The fourth area is all about gas-electric coordination. You'll hear again more about this later. This has really many forms. Certainly one ways in which it's come up is in New England. I can tell you that my colleague Dan Dolan, who used to work for us, spends a lot of time in New England, where while they, as New England policymakers often say, there are only hundreds of miles from cheap gas in the Marcellus, but they can't get the gas to New England. So really, New England has sort of been the focal point of debate, how to bring more gas infrastructure into New England. And that's really where some of these choices come about that frankly become battles. You heard the comment in the first speaker about potentially bringing hydro in from Canada. My late grandmother, who lived about 10 miles from this airport, was from Canada, so she wouldn't want me to say anything bad about Canadians. But it's a fight in New England because the governors are attracted to the Canadian hydro. It's certainly low carbon, but the problem is that it's owned by a provincially owned company in the form of Hydro-Quebec. And the question is whether or not bringing subsidized hydro, subsidized through the way in which it would be paid for the transmission, and otherwise they would get long-term contracts, whereas the rest of us would be fighting in the daily and markets for energy and the yearly auctions for capacity. So the question is, why would you want to advantage one fuel over another? New England has tried to look at building more gas pipelines. We've had a debate now for several years with the pipeline industry. Again, we don't have, the nature of wholesale markets is not to have long-term contracts. Certainly some do in certain situations, and people can hedge, but the way the actual RTO markets are run, they're intentionally a day ahead in real-time markets with the capacity market forward 3 years in New England as a backstop. But that model, our model on the power side, which puts much more of the risk on us as investors and developers, doesn't match up well with what happens on the pipeline side. So I think we finally reached a point where the pipelines understand we're not going to be in a position to sign 15 and 20-year contracts for gas volumes, which is what they want to then back the building of new pipelines into New England. So then what happened is the governors became creative, and the first proposal that had the shelf life of about a year or so was to say, well, let's have the transmission tariffs in New England cover the cost of new gas pipelines. Again, the gas pipeline developers would get their 15 and 20-year contracts, pretty decent regulated rate of return, but the risk would then shift to electricity ratepayers through the way in which the transmission tariffs are allocated. That then raised a whole host of legal issues. Is this something that the RTO could and should do? Is it even legal under the Federal Power Act? That issue, or that proposal, I think, has sort of gone away, particularly after many of the sponsors among the governors went out of office as of the last election. So the latest proposal in New England is to discuss possibly having the actual local distribution companies on the gas side contract for the pipeline capacity. They would then resell that capacity to power generators. It would also be part of an effort by some governors to expand the use of gas for heating and other residential purposes in New England, which, as you know, has traditionally been a fuel oil dependent area. And then even if you can get the financing, the question in New England really does revolve around siting. Congressman I once worked for, who was the senior Republican on the House Energy Committee, teamed up with now Senator Markey several decades ago to build the Iroquois gas pipeline when the Shore nuclear plant closed on Long Island. I can tell you back in the early 1990s and late 1990s, it was difficult to get that pipeline built under the Long Island Sound. Imagine what the siting restrictions would be like today. The other aspect of gas-electric coordination to be aware of is that the FERC just recently decided, called the balls and strikes in a battle between at least the eastern RTOs and the entire gas industry about whether or not to move the start of the natural gas day. So as you know, now the gas day starts at 9 a.m. Central. The FERC proposal, which was put out for comment last year, was to move that up to 4 a.m. We in the power sector, at least among our membership, we've had members who were split almost evenly between either 9 and 4. Nobody wanted 6:30 or 7:15. It was either you were for 9 or you were for 4. I think that was true of the power industry as a whole. The gas sector, I can tell you, from the producers to the pipelines through to the LDCs, particularly those from the West, were vehemently opposed. Stories, and I don't mean to belittle them, but concerns about putting people out in the middle of production fields at 2, 3 in the morning, and what all would have to be done to comply with, if every whole country would be moving. This reminded me of the days we used to battle between the oil-producing states and oil-consuming states. When I first got to Capitol Hill as a staffer, now it was an east-west battle. People, understandably, in the West felt like, why am I going to have to change what I do as a business practice to deal with a New England mid-Atlantic problem? So the FERC saw the writing on the wall, both legally and on the substance, and at its meeting last month decided not to approve the moving of the gas side. But what they did do, which was very important, is they've gone out to the RTOs and said, okay, we're going to keep the gas day where it is. We're going to change the timely nomination cycles to provide more flexibility. So the gas side of the gas-electric interface is pretty well set. Now the ball's in the court of the RTOs to look at their scheduling practices to see if they can't find a way to better align the power day with the gas day so that power marketers and power generators have a better sense of what the gas market looks like before they have to respond to the day-ahead commitments and then later, of course, the real-time commitments. So there's a lot of activity now at the RTO level. One of the priorities that came to our board meeting was to look more carefully at the processing times at the RTOs, because right now, I think PJM takes 4 hours or so, 3.5, 4 hours to turn around some of these calculations. This is the data supercomputer, not the old slide rule. So there's hope and expectation and certainly pressure on our part to try to make that go a little bit smoother and speed it up. The last issue there is weekend gas. Our members are having a lot of difficulty on weekends. So in the polar vortex, people had to schedule gas on Friday, at least through Monday, sometimes Friday through Tuesday. We work with the Intercontinental Exchange. While it's lightly used at the moment, ICE has put out, and we appreciate their help, new products so that gas generators have as much flexibility as possible. And so there's products out there now for individual weekend days as well as the entire weekend. The fifth issue is one that is going to be with us, I think, for a while, and that is sort of the whole question of how much do we let economics make these decisions as opposed to, I guess, for lack of a better shorthand, politics. It started out with battles at the state level on whether new gas plants should be subsidized. So this was largely a Maryland and New Jersey question in the Mid-Atlantic, where notwithstanding the fact that the market was well oversupplied, that capacity markets cleared with excess resources, reserve margins were met without a problem. States, and this is happening in different ways, wanted to kind of keep things within the state. So there's been this tension, and there'll continue to be this tension between what's sort of national and federal, both legally and operationally, and policy choices that are made, as opposed to each state going it alone. So in the case of New Jersey and Maryland, they wanted to subsidize new gas construction, notwithstanding that the economics didn't really work out. We and others pointed out this was going to be bad for the existing developers as well as new developers who didn't get the subsidized gas contracts. The states went ahead anyway. Both of the courts of appeals struck them down as violating the Federal Power Act for attempting to set wholesale rates, which is within FERC's jurisdiction. And that question is presently before the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court will soon decide whether or not to take the cases. The states have appealed. The implications go broader than New Jersey and Maryland, because while it was the first uneconomic entry that was coming into the market to alter how market dynamics would otherwise work, now it's this whole question of uneconomic exit. Rightly or wrongly, there's a lot of economic pressures I mentioned earlier on some coal assets, on some nuclear assets, even on some inefficient gas assets. And so you're seeing now proceedings like in Ohio, where several of the utilities in the state that has decided to go to market now want to wall off some plants for protection, while everybody else will be fighting in the market system. The dynamic is a little bit different in Illinois, depending on which of our members you talk to, but there's a similar aspect of commonality in that each state is looking to see what makes the most sense for them. All at the same time, the Clean Power Plan is out there, and it's unclear how this will turn out. I think we'll know certainly more in Ohio very soon, and the Illinois legislature is poised to act or not by the end of the month. And last but not least, I would mention Congress. Again, Congress has sort of been the sleeping giant. We haven't had a major piece of energy legislation since 2005 or 2007, depending if you consider the 2005 law to be major. Certainly the 2005 Act was. And now, all of a sudden, in the last week to 10 days, there's been literally a flurry of activity, dozens of bills dropped in the Senate and House discussion drafts flowing and flying around. And it's relevant to this debate because you know you've arrived, and gas has certainly arrived and is thriving as a fuel for power generation, when everybody else starts shooting at you. The gas has gone from the Fuel Use Act, we're going to ban it, we're not going to allow it, to now where people see gas's natural advantages from an environmental standpoint, the economic advantages from what seems to be a tremendous amount of supply at a reasonable cost. And now it was once banned and then sort of poo-pooed. When I first got this job as the CEO of a major utility, talked about how, well, let the IPPs do those little gas plants, but the bulk of the system is really going to be all about coal and nuclear. And of course now it's really all about natural gas. So what you have happening, those who are seeing themselves disadvantaged on the business side make snide comments about how, well, gas only flows at 22 or 23 miles an hour. Look at the polar vortex, we can't really rely on it. So you see these proposals, like I said, in Ohio and elsewhere. And then on the environmental side, it doesn't quite necessarily hit those of us depending on what state you're in, but I can tell you we just had our state and regional partner planning meeting downtown Chicago last week, and our state affiliate in California is always reminding me that what was once the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign is now the Sierra Club's Beyond Gas campaign in the state of California, and that's also true in New England and a few other pockets. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that was once this sleepy agency at 888 First Street Northeast, is now regularly visited monthly by protesters. So much so that the monthly meeting this month, which would normally have occurred next Thursday, a week from now, a week and 2 days from now, was moved up to this week because there's an organized protest movement. People have actually had civil disobedience. I spoke at a conference on the Clean Power Plan. The first couple times that someone mentioned the word natural gas, the protesters in the audience shouted dirty fuel and other epithets about gas. Don't get me wrong, I think that's a fringe element in our country, but nonetheless, you're going to continue to see protests, and it behooves the industry to do what it's been doing, which is to get the facts out there and to make it clear that gas does have an important and critical role to play. So that really brings me to three conclusions before we wrap up. The first is it a bridge or a destination? I was asked to answer. Everybody talks about it as a bridge. Sometimes that annoys the gas members in my membership, I can tell you, because a bridge is like a bridge to somewhere, a bridge to nowhere, a bridge to what? And they don't see it as merely a bridge, they see it as a bedrock of the power system going forward as it is today. So when there's discussion about baseload and fuel diversity, which are important values, we always point out that natural gas can be baseload. It is baseload in many markets today. Once gas was what made the fuel system more diverse. So we've really worked very closely together with the other groups to not make this about one fuel or another, to try to make this about improving the rules for everybody. And so I think whether you want to say it's a bridge or a destination, we're going to need gas for a long time. The second thing is it really is a transformation underway. People talk about it a lot, but it's so easy. Just like when we were debating the Maryland and New Jersey legislation, everybody wants to go to the opening of the new power plant, have the ribbon cutting, politicians get their pictures taken. Everybody wants the latest new thing. It's just like part of human nature, right? Whether it's the Apple Watch, last week it was Tesla and the batteries they've come out with. There certainly is a transformation taking place. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see it all happen, but certainly our children and grandchildren are going to have more choices, more options, ability to self-supply, as some are doing today through rooftop solar. And this is all happening out in a totally different market environment than in the past. In the past, we were all competing into a growing market. Now we're competing into a market that's relatively flat in terms of demand. But the fact of the matter is, while retirements of existing plants will provide great opportunities for gas, we're not going to go home on Friday and wake up to go to work on Monday and have a system that's completely renewables and megawatts and some of these new fancy things that have been talked about. And so the challenge we have as an organization, the challenge all of you have, the broader sector has, is to make sure people understand we're going to continue to need central station power plants, we're going to continue to need the grid. So as we debate issues like net metering and we look at renewables policies and the Clean Power Plan, it all has to hang together. And that's probably my biggest concern. And last point is that right now these issues are decided separately. We tend to debate and consider, well, the Clean Power Plan today, and maybe a state-level renewables issue tomorrow, and some issue with FERC that seems esoteric that goes to the bottom line of the company. What we haven't figured out to do, and it's challenging in the federal system, where jurisdiction over energy policy, particularly electricity, is so spread out, to have a coordinated approach. But the need is still there to do it, and we hope to be part of the debate to make that happen. So I'll stop there. I think we have time for some questions now, and I'm pleased to stay with Lopa and others for the panel a little bit later, and appreciate your attention. Thanks for the chance to participate.
Any questions?
Coffee didn't take it yet. Great, I'm off the hook. Thanks.